The Tohoku Rakuten Golden Eagles have been the pride and joy of the city of Sendai since the club's inception in 2005. Their inception was done as a way to satisfy the players' demands for a team to balance the 6-team structure of the Pacific League, following the merger between the Osaka Kintetsu Buffaloes and Orix BlueWave to become the Orix Buffaloes, which in itself has quite the insane story of its own, and I highly recommend Gaijin Baseball's video on the merger, because there are a whole lot of other stories surrounding this merger that I'll not get into here. Anyway, NPB wanted this new team to be based out of Sendai. You might be asking yourself, why Sendai? Well, the year before, the Nippon Ham Fighters, tired of having to compete against the Yomiuri Giants and Yakult Swallows, two more established teams in the capital city, and the insane rent that the Tokyo Dome was basically charging them, decided that they wanted out of Tokyo after 2003. NPB wanted them to move to Sapporo and Hokkaido because they wanted to expand north. Plus, by 2004, Sapporo was already the 5th largest city in Japan, so an NPB team there could be sustainable. Plus, in 2001, Sapporo built the Sapporo Dome in hopes of attracting a professional team, in which they were successful in doing, luring Toshiba's corporate soccer team away from Kawasaki, which is the team that we now know today as Hokkaido Concerto Sapporo. They then became the Hokkaido Nippon Ham Fighters, and immediately after this move, they became a success, not only going from 5th to 3rd and making the newly formed Pacific League playoffs, they were a success in the box office too, given that they were now representing the entirety of the island of Hokkaido. So logically, NPB wanted to have another team in northern Japan, and Sendai was the perfect fit. When the Chiba Lotte Marines, then known as the Lotte Orions, had issues finding a stadium in the greater Tokyo area, they opted to play part-time in Miyagi, which in the NPB community was referred to as the Gypsy Lotte era. And the crowds they were attracting there were so large, it pretty much seemed as if this would be the perfect permanent market for them to move into. That was, however, until the 1974 Japan series, when the Orions were essentially forced to play at Korakuen Stadium. Then things proceed to hit the ceiling when Lotte, in a short-sighted maneuver, decided that despite celebrating them winning the PL pennant against the Hankyu Braves in Sendai, and Sendai was where the fans loved to watch them, they would have the parade in Tokyo, where barely anyone ever cared that they even played there. This would end up being the gut punch that killed any interest in Sendai's residents would have to watch them, more so when the Orions made the Pacific League playoffs in 1977, when the stadium was only barely half full. This sour relationship would eventually come to an end in 1978, when the Taiyo Whales moved out of Kawasaki Stadium to Yokohama Stadium, which freed up a stadium in the greater Tokyo area, which was where the Orions would end up moving. So, baseball in Sendai can work. They just needed a team that would permanently stay there and not just make Sendai a part-time home. Ultimately, two companies stepped up to the plate to make a bid to give Sendai their own baseball team. Well, obviously, we ended up with the Tohoku Rakuten Golden Eagles. Just who was this other team named the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix? Well, let's start from the very beginning. After the Buffaloes-BlueWave merger was announced in 2004, a businessman named Takafumi Hori, who was the president of an internet services company named Livedoor, officially began proposing purchasing the Kintetsu Buffaloes on July 29, 2004. With Hori wanting to keep the team independent in order to keep NPB's 12-team structure as it was. However, Kintetsu president Masanori Yamaguchi turned down Hori's proposal to buy the Buffaloes, despite it being favored by the players. Yamaguchi would stand his ground, stating that he, quote, wouldn't accept such an idea, and that he wouldn't even see the possibility of selling to Livedoor. And while one can cry that this is a case of beggars trying to be choosers, as we will see later, this would end up being a wise choice on Yamaguchi's end, but I am getting way too ahead of myself. Anyway, while Livedoor was spending quite a lot of money trying to buy the Buffaloes, Hori expressed interest in starting his own NPB team if buying the Buffaloes wouldn't work out, and that would be what would end up happening anyway, because Livedoor gave up on buying them once all 12 NPB owners officially approved the Buffaloes-BlueWave merger on September 8th. 9 days later, Livedoor officially created a new company named Livedoor Baseball to officially apply for expansion into NPB. Shortly after Livedoor's announcement that they were going to make a bid to enter NPB, Another internet service company, Rakuten, and its president, Hiroshi Mikitani, also officially announced their desire to join NPB2. In October, more details would be publicized about Livedoor's bid for NPB. Their new team would be named the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix, with their manager being Hanshin Tigers and Yakult Swallows Gaijin legend Tom O'Malley, and their general manager being sports writer Katsunori Kojima. Also in October, NPB owners began the screening process for the bids of both Rakuten and Livedoor, which had to be quickly done because of the fear brought upon them after the 2-day player strike, since the players were now demanding for a 6th team to be made to fill the space left behind by the merger. The panel would consist of Hajime Tohoku, the chairman of the Central League, and officials from the Yomiuri Giants, Chiba Lotte Marines, and Yokohama Bay Stars. As for the opinions that the public had on these two expansion bids, in a telephone survey that was conducted by Kyodo News throughout the Tohoku region, with a sample size of 300 people, 40% of the respondents, which equals 120 people, favored the Livedoor Phoenix to be the team selected, while only 7% favored the Rakuten Eagles, which equaled to 21 participants. In one of the first screenings involved, it would ask both Hori and Mikitani on what were their plans to do to Miyagi Baseball Stadium in order to get properly ready for their teams. When it was Livedoor and Hori's turn to present their proposal on this, he claimed he'd only need 2.5 billion yen to finish the renovations, and that the renovations can be finished in the middle of the 2005 season. Later on, another screening would occur, which would focus on the morals of the two companies. The board first the question on what actions would the two companies would do to avoid kids from easily accessing adult websites both companies were hosting on their web services. Hori, in what would kind of turn out to be a short-sighted decision, said that Livedoor doesn't exactly have control over what sites people would visit, using the metaphor that the internet is basically like open road spaces and that they cannot monitor what happens on them. So basically he was just saying, I know how to do it, lol. Ultimately, the NPB team owners would choose Mikitani and Rakuten's bid for the Sendai team over Hori and Livedoor's bid, which would mark the first non-merger, non-acquisition new team in NPB since the creation of the Takahashi Unions in 1954. For a quick run-through on what was Rakuten's response and plans for their bid, Rakuten's plan was to have their manager be former NPB player Yasushi Tao, and their general manager being baseball executive Marty Kunert. Their plans for Miyagi Baseball Stadium was to keep the stadium's capacity at 23,000 for 2005, then focus on the stadium renovations during the off-season and get it all done before 2006. In addition, they would now need 3.2 billion yen to do these renovations. So now you might be asking me, if Hori claims he and Livedoor couldn't control what sites people visit, what was Mikitani and Rakuten's solution? Well then, Mikitani would present the idea of using identity verification with methods that can verify age, such as someone's credit card, and that they have already taken measures to prevent minors from accessing adult websites that they were hosting on their web services. Oh, and remember what I told you about the whole polling on the public and how Livedoor was the likely candidate to be picked in the eyes of the public? Well, Rakuten was pretty much the one that was truly the candidate to be picked. Mikitani not only had an extensive business network, but in the sports scene, through Rakuten's parent club Crimson Group, they had already owned J-League club Vissel Kobe. So yeah, Mikitani already knew what he was coming into when he proposed the Rakuten Eagles. So, what would happen to Hori and Livedoor, and what would an alternate universe out there hypothetically look like if NPB chose the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix? Well, after Hori and Livedoor lost the bid, out of retaliation that Rakuten did win the bid, Hori immediately proceeded to trademark the Eagles name that Mikitani had planned to name his franchise, which basically ended in a quick legal battle where Mikitani just paid Hori just to piss off. Even worse on both Hori and Livedoor's end, Hori himself would be arrested for securities and accounting fraud, which included him submitting falsified information on Livedoor's fiscal financial information for the year ended September 2004. Hori would then eventually be sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for this. And as for what would hypothetically happen if the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix was the chosen team instead of the Tohoku Rakuten Golden Eagles, it would have basically ended up being a bigger sinkhole than the one they'd already started. To put it bluntly, it would have been like that funny Ruben sim clip from his video, The Electric State Hospital Experience, where his solution would be to get a bullet out would be to use another bullet. After that came out that Hori had been arrested for financial and security fraud, investors quickly began panic selling shares of Livedoor, and then after 4 months where the company's stock took a 90% dip and clear evidence of securities and financial fraud, Livedoor was taken off the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which eventually caused Japan to pass the Financial Instruments and Exchange Act, where companies were mandated certain practices in record keeping. So why am I mentioning a lot of this business stuff? Well, it is a bit important to give context into Livedoor's financial situation at the time. If the Phoenix had been the chosen team, then by 2006, the team would basically be in financial ruin, and theoretically, financially crippled to a point where they would now be looking to sell or have to fold entirely. So in other words, if the Phoenix were chosen, then NPB would be back to square one, having now replaced a financially bankrupt team with another one. So basically NPB dodged the bullet by choosing to go with Mikitani and Rakuten, leading to the Tohoku Rakuten Golden Eagles. This probably might also end up being a bit of a PR nightmare because, while obviously yes they could just go back to getting Mikitani and Rakuten's bid, it would probably be a PR mess that they chose a company that was on the way of being financially bankrupt because they were actually actively committing fraud at the time of their founding. In conclusion, the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix was an attempt to try to be the one to bring baseball back to the Tohoku region. Unfortunately, they failed, and unfortunately more, the company that ran the operation went down with it spectacularly. And that is the story of the Sendai Livedoor Phoenix, the other NPB team vying to be in Sendai.